Get him out of here. The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy and deliberate, cutting through the soft hum of jazz and clinking glasses like a blade wrapped in silk. Heads turned in slow unison across the grand hotel lobby, where crystal chandeliers spilled warm light over polished marble floors that reflected everything, every movement, every stare, every judgment. Marcus Reed stood near the edge of the room, just outside the velvet rope that separated guests from everyone else. His jacket was clean but worn at the seams, his shoes carrying the faint dust of a long day's work, not the glossy shine of status. A few feet away, a server paused mid-step, unsure whether to move or disappear. The air shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a room deciding who mattered and who didn't. Ethan Caldwell didn't raise his voice again. He didn't need to. The authority in his posture did the work for him. Tailored suit, cufflinks catching the light, a glass of red wine resting effortlessly in his hand. He didn't look angry. He looked inconvenienced. And to him, that was worse. Marcus didn't respond right away. He didn't argue, didn't explain. His eyes moved, not toward Ethan, but toward the contract folder resting open on the glass table beside him, its pages slightly curled under the weight of a gold pen. Around them, whispers began to form, quiet and sharp. Someone chuckled under their breath. Another lifted a phone just a little higher, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light. The moment stretched, thin and fragile. Marcus adjusted his grip on the small toolkit in his hand, the metal edges cool against his palm. He had been called in for a routine fix, something minor, something forgettable. A loose panel, a flickering system, the kind of work that kept buildings running but never earned a second glance. Yet now, every eye in the room was on him, not for what he did, but for where he stood. Ethan took a slow sip of his wine, never breaking eye contact. "This area is for invited guests," he said, calm, measured, each word placed with precision. "You've already overstayed." A ripple of agreement passed through the small crowd gathered nearby, subtle nods, faint smiles, the quiet comfort of being on the right side of a line they didn't draw but were happy to enforce. Marcus finally lifted his gaze, not defensive, not angry, just steady. The chandelier light caught in his eyes, reflecting something unreadable, something that didn't match the role they had already assigned him. He glanced once more at the open contract, then back at Ethan. The room seemed to lean in, the music fading into the background, replaced by the soft, almost imperceptible sound of breath being held. Marcus exhaled slowly, the tension settling into stillness rather than breaking it. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried, clear, grounded, impossible to ignore. "If you sign that," he paused, just long enough for the silence to deepen, for the weight of attention to settle fully into the space between them. His eyes didn't waver. "You're not just making a mistake." Another beat. Even the server had stopped moving now, tray suspended midair. "You're handing everything over." The words didn't rush. They landed, one by one, deliberate, anchored in a calm that didn't belong to someone out of place. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Ethan's face. Not doubt, not yet, but something close to it. Then it was gone, replaced by the same polished certainty. But the room had changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough that the silence no longer belonged entirely to him. Marcus did not move after he spoke, and that stillness became its own kind of presence, something that did not belong to the role they had already written for him, something that did not ask for permission to exist in that room. The chandelier light above him flickered slightly, not enough for anyone to notice unless they were already looking too closely, but Marcus noticed, the way he always noticed small inconsistencies others ignored. It was the same instinct that kept him employed in places like this, moving through systems and structures that only worked because someone like him made sure they did. His job title was simple, forgettable, printed in small letters on a temporary badge clipped near his chest, but the work behind it was anything but. Hours earlier, before the guests arrived and the music softened the edges of the space, Marcus had been in the service corridors behind the walls, where the air was cooler and the lighting harsher, tracing a signal issue through a network panel that controlled the building's communication systems. He had followed the wiring the way a mechanic follows a sound, patient, methodical, listening more than looking. That was how he had found it. Not just the technical fault, But the open access line connected to the executive network, a line that should have been isolated, protected, invisible. It was not his job to read what passed through it, but patterns have a way of revealing themselves, even when you are not looking for them. Numbers repeated. Names surfaced. Terms that did not belong in routine maintenance logs appeared where they should not have been. Marcus had not reacted then. He never did. He simply noted, stored, and moved on, because most of the time, speaking up cost more than it gave back. But when he stepped into the lobby later and saw the same contract folder now resting in plain sight, the same names printed along the header, something aligned too clearly to ignore. Across from him now, Ethan Caldwell shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his confidence still intact, but no longer effortless. He tapped the edge of the folder with his pen, once, twice, a small rhythmic motion that suggested control but carried a trace of impatience underneath. "You are out of line," Ethan said, his tone even, but sharper than before, like a blade being adjusted rather than drawn. A few people nodded again, quicker this time, eager to restore the balance they understood. Marcus heard them, the quiet agreement, the soft reinforcement of a system that did not require proof, only hierarchy. He lowered his eyes briefly, not in submission, but in thought, as if replaying something only he could see. The reflection of the marble floor caught his movement, doubling him for a moment. One version standing in the room, the other existing just beneath the surface, separated by nothing more than a thin layer of polished stone. "I was not trying to interrupt," Marcus said finally, his voice steady, measured, each word placed carefully so it could not be dismissed as emotion. "I was trying to prevent something." The word prevent lingered, heavier than expected, carrying weight that did not match his position. Someone near the back let out a short laugh, quickly covered by a sip of champagne, but it did not spread the way it had before. The room did not fully return to its earlier rhythm. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, as if he were trying to decide whether Marcus was worth dismissing or addressing. The music in the background continued, soft piano notes drifting through the air, but they felt distant now, like something happening in another space entirely. Marcus did not add anything else. He did not defend himself or elaborate. He simply stood there, grounded, as if the floor beneath him belonged to him as much as anyone else in that room. And for the first time, that assumption did not feel entirely unreasonable. The silence did not break. It shifted, bending slightly toward Ethan Caldwell, as if the room itself was waiting for him to restore its order. And he understood that instinctively, the way men like him always did, not because they were told, but because they had never needed to be. He set his glass down with a soft, controlled motion on the edge of the table, the faint click against the glass surface sharper than it should have been, drawing attention back to him where it belonged. His posture straightened, shoulders squared, chin lifted just enough to re-establish distance. Not physical, but social, the kind that could not be measured in feet or inches, but was felt in every glance and every hesitation around him. "Prevent," Ethan repeated, his voice calm but edged now with something colder, something less patient, as if the word itself had crossed a line it should not have approached. A few quiet chuckles returned, more cautious this time, like people testing whether it was safe to laugh again. He let his gaze travel over Marcus slowly, deliberately, taking in the worn edges of his sleeves, the simple badge, the toolkit still resting at his side, assembling a picture that confirmed what he already believed. "You are here to fix wiring, correct?" he continued, each word precise, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation. "Then fix wiring. Do not insert yourself into conversations that are far outside your scope." The statement settled over the group like a verdict, clean and final, and for a moment, it seemed to restore the balance everyone understood. A man near the front nodded quickly, another adjusted his tie, relieved to see the lines redrawn so clearly. But Marcus did not react the way they expected. He did not shrink back or step away. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, not retreating, just grounding himself more firmly, as if aligning with something beneath the surface that no one else could see. His eyes moved once more to the contract, then back to Ethan, steady, unhurried. "It is connected," Marcus said quietly, not raising his voice, but not softening it either. The words landed differently this time, less like a warning and more like a statement of fact. Ethan's brow tightened, just enough to register irritation, but not enough to show uncertainty. "What is connected?" he asked, a hint of impatience slipping through the control. Marcus did not answer immediately. The pause stretched, thin but deliberate, and in that pause, the room leaned again, attention shifting back to him despite every expectation that it should not. "The system you asked to be repaired," Marcus said finally, his tone even, grounded. "The one running your internal network. It is not isolated." A faint murmur rippled through the edges of the crowd, subtle but present, like wind brushing against a closed window. Ethan's expression did not change, but something behind it sharpened, calculating now, measuring risk instead of dismissing it. "And you are telling me this now, in the middle of a private event?" he replied, the emphasis on private clear, deliberate, a reminder of boundaries. Marcus held his gaze. "I am telling you before you sign something that depends on that system being secure," he said. No hesitation. No apology. The words did not challenge Ethan's authority, but they did not bow to it either. For the first time, the room did not immediately respond. No laughter. No quick agreement. Just a stillness that felt heavier than before, as if the polished certainty that had filled the space minutes ago had developed a hairline crack, invisible to most, but undeniable once seen. Ethan's fingers rested on the edge of the contract, the gold pin still lying across the page, untouched now. He did not pick it up. Not yet. And that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed. The hesitation lingered just long enough to be noticed, and that was all it took to shift the weight of the room again, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that made people stop mid-breath without realizing why. Ethan Caldwell's fingers hovered near the pen, then pulled back slightly, a movement so small it could have been dismissed, except now every detail seemed to carry meaning. He exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, as if recalibrating the situation in real time. "You are making a serious claim," he said, his voice lower now, less performative, more contained, though still wrapped in authority. "And you are doing it without context, without clearance, and without any understanding of what is actually at stake." The words were sharp, but they did not land as cleanly as before. A few people shifted their stance, their confidence no longer automatic, their eyes moving between Ethan and Marcus as if waiting for something to settle. Marcus did not rush to fill the space. He let the silence stretch again, not as defiance, but as precision, choosing when to speak instead of reacting to pressure. The soft hum of the ventilation system became noticeable, a low mechanical breath behind the stillness, steady and indifferent. Marcus lifted his hand slightly, not to gesture dramatically, but to indicate the direction of the building behind the walls, the systems no one in the room ever thought about. "The panel I repaired runs through your executive network," he said, his tone unchanged, grounded in observation rather than accusation. It was bridged to an external line. Not by accident. A subtle shift moved through the crowd, like a ripple passing under glass. Someone near the back leaned closer to another guest, whispering something. Too quiet to catch. Ethan's jaw tightened just enough to register, his gaze sharpening as he studied Marcus more carefully now, not as an interruption, but as a variable that had not been accounted for. "External line?" Ethan repeated, slower this time, as if testing the phrase for weight. Marcus nodded once. "Open access. No firewall separation. It is feeding data both ways." The simplicity of the explanation made it harder to dismiss. There was no jargon meant to impress, no attempt to elevate himself. Just facts, laid out in a way that anyone could understand if they chose to listen. Ethan's eyes flicked briefly to the contract again, then back to Marcus, and for the first time, the connection between the two did not feel abstract. "And you are certain of this?" Ethan said, not quite a question, not quite a challenge. Marcus did not hesitate. "I do not speak unless I am certain." The words settled differently than anything before them, not loud, not forceful, but anchored in something that did not rely on status to hold its ground. The room did not react immediately. No laughter followed. No quick dismissal. Just a quiet recalibration, as if the invisible lines that defined who could speak and who could not were being redrawn in real time. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward one of his associates standing a few feet away, a man in a dark suit who had remained silent until now, his expression composed but watchful. "Daniel," Ethan said, his voice measured. "Check the system logs." The request was simple, but it carried a shift in direction that everyone could feel. Daniel hesitated for half a second, just enough to reveal that this was not part of the planned sequence of the evening, then reached for his tablet. The glow of the screen reflected faintly against his face as he began navigating through layers of information that most people in the room would never see. Marcus did not move. He did not step forward or step back. He simply stood where he was, the quiet center of a moment that had begun with dismissal and was now unfolding into something far less certain. The music continued somewhere in the background, but it no longer defined the space. The room was listening now, not to Ethan, not to Marcus alone, but to the possibility that something important had been said at the exact moment it was needed. Daniel's fingers moved quickly across the tablet, but not with the relaxed confidence he had a moment ago. Each tap now measured, deliberate, as if the screen in his hands had suddenly become heavier than it looked. The faint glow illuminated the tension in his jaw, the slight tightening around his eyes as lines of data began to populate in front of him. At first, nothing in the room changed. Conversations remained paused, glasses still hovered midair, and the soft music continued its distant rhythm. But then Daniel stopped scrolling. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a subtle pause, his thumb resting against the edge of the screen as his focus locked onto something specific. Ethan noticed it immediately. "Well?" he asked, his tone controlled but no longer effortless, the single word carrying more weight than before. Daniel did not answer right away. He leaned in slightly, adjusting the angle of the tablet as if the information might change depending on how he looked at it. The silence stretched again, thinner this time, more fragile, like something about to give. "There is an open channel," Daniel said finally, his voice lower than usual, less certain, as if he was choosing each word carefully to avoid saying too much too quickly. A quiet shift moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. Someone set their glass down. Another person straightened, attention sharpening. Ethan's expression remained composed, but the stillness in his posture deepened, no longer casual, now deliberate. "Explain," Ethan said. Daniel swallowed once, barely noticeable, then continued. "It is tied into the internal system. Data packets are moving through it, continuously. It should not be active during an event like this." The words landed in pieces, each one adding weight to the last. Ethan's eyes flicked to the contract again, then back to Daniel, then briefly, almost reluctantly, toward Marcus. That glance did not last long, but it was enough. Marcus stood exactly where he had been, unchanged, unaffected by the shift in tone around him, his presence steady in a way that now felt less like coincidence and more like certainty. "Can it be shut down?" Ethan asked. The question came quickly, controlled, but it carried something new beneath it, something closer to urgency. Daniel hesitated again, this time longer. "Not immediately," he said. "It is embedded deeper than a standard access point. If we cut it without tracing it, we could lose visibility on what is being transferred." A faint murmur spread through the edges of the group, no longer dismissive, now edged with concern. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was no longer intact. It had fractured, quietly, under the weight of information no one had expected to hear. Ethan's grip tightened slightly on the edge of the table, his fingers pressing into the glass surface as if grounding himself. "What is being transferred?" he asked. Daniel's eyes scanned the screen again, faster now, more focused. "Contracts, internal drafts, financial projections," he said, each category sharper than the last. "Including the one you are about to sign." The room went still in a way it had not before. Not polite silence, not social pause, real stillness, the kind that settles when something undeniable surfaces. Ethan did not speak immediately. His gaze lowered to the document in front of him, the gold pin resting across the page like a decision that had been waiting to happen. Now it looked different. Not like authority, not like control, like risk. He lifted his eyes slowly, this time not just toward Daniel, but directly at Marcus. The distance between them, the invisible line that had defined everything minutes ago, no longer felt fixed. It felt uncertain, as if it had been drawn in the wrong place all along. Marcus met his gaze without hesitation, without triumph, without even satisfaction. Just clarity. And in that clarity, something shifted again, deeper this time, not just in the room, but in the understanding of who had been speaking and who had been listening. The room did not recover right away, and that absence of motion became its own kind of gravity, pulling every glance, every breath, into a single quiet center where nothing could be ignored anymore. The music still played, soft and distant, but it no longer belonged to the moment. It felt misplaced now, like something left running in a space that had already changed. Ethan Caldwell remained where he stood, his hand resting near the contract, but not touching it, not claiming it the way he had only minutes ago. The confidence that once filled his posture had not disappeared, but it had shifted, tightened, like something forced to fit a shape it was not designed for. Across from him, Marcus Reed did not move. He stood with the same quiet steadiness, the same measured breath, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze clear, not pressing forward, not retreating, simply present in a way that no longer required permission. The chandelier light above them cast soft reflections across the marble floor, stretching their silhouettes side by side, no longer separated by distance, but aligned in a way that felt almost deliberate. Daniel lowered the tablet slightly, his fingers still wrapped around it, but no longer moving. He did not need to scroll anymore. The information was already there, already confirmed, already too real to dismiss. A faint sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, the low hum of systems continuing their work, indifferent to the shift happening above them. Marcus heard it. He always did. It was the same steady rhythm he had followed earlier, tracing connections others never saw, listening to patterns hidden behind polished surfaces and quiet assumptions. Ethan finally exhaled, slow and controlled, but heavier than before, as if something inside him had recalculated and was still adjusting to the result. He glanced once more at the contract, then at Daniel, and then, without hesitation this time, back to Marcus. That look held longer now, not as an evaluation, not as a dismissal, but as recognition of something he had not accounted for. You said it was not an accident. Ethan spoke, his voice lower, stripped of its earlier edge, replaced by something more precise. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement waiting for confirmation. Marcus gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but certain. No, he said. The words settled cleanly, without weight, without force, just truth placed exactly where it belonged. The room seemed to lean into that simplicity, as if the absence of exaggeration made it harder to resist. No one laughed. No one whispered. Even the smallest sounds had faded, replaced by a silence that did not feel empty, but full, like something important was being understood without needing to be explained. Ethan's hand finally moved, not toward the pen, but away from it, sliding it slightly to the side of the document, breaking the line that had once connected him to a decision already made in his mind. It was a small motion, but it carried more meaning than any command he had given earlier. Marcus watched it happen, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with the same calm awareness he had carried from the beginning. He had not come into the room to win anything. He had come because something needed to be said before it was too late. And now, in the quiet that followed, it was clear that the moment had already shifted beyond control, beyond hierarchy, into something else entirely. Something honest. Something that did not depend on who spoke first, but on who chose to listen. Daniel's screen refreshed again, a subtle flicker that barely registered to anyone except him, but this time he leaned in closer, his brows drawing together not in confusion, but in recognition, the kind that comes when something familiar appears where it should not. His thumb hovered over the display, not scrolling, not tapping, just holding still as his eyes traced a line of text that seemed to anchor everything else around it. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. "What is it?" he asked, quieter now, the authority still there, but no longer absolute, now searching for clarity instead of enforcing it. Daniel did not answer right away. His gaze remained fixed, his breathing slower, as if he was aligning what he saw with something he already knew. Then, almost under his breath, he said, "This signature, this authorization layer, it is not external." The words landed softly, but they carried weight, enough to draw the attention of those closest to him. Ethan stepped half a pace forward, closing the distance just slightly, his focus narrowing. "What do you mean not external?" Daniel turned the tablet toward him, angling the screen so the information could be seen, though most in the room could not fully understand it. Still, the reaction did not depend on comprehension. It depended on tone. It is routed through a parent system, Daniel continued, his voice steadier now, more certain. A system that sits above this entire network. One that has override authority. A faint tension passed through Ethan's posture, not visible in any obvious way, but present in the stillness of his hands, the way his fingers no longer moved at all. That is not possible, Ethan said, almost automatically, though the conviction behind it was thinner than before. Daniel shook his head once. It is already happening. The silence that followed felt different from the ones before. Not uncertain, not waiting. Realization had entered the room, and it did not need permission to stay. Ethan's eyes moved across the screen, scanning quickly now, absorbing pieces without needing every detail. Then his gaze shifted, slowly, deliberately, away from the tablet and back toward Marcus. This time, there was no dismissal in it. No impatience. Just a question forming without being spoken. Marcus stood as he had from the beginning, unchanged, his posture steady, his expression calm, but now the space around him felt altered, as if something unseen had stepped forward in his place. Daniel hesitated, then spoke again, more clearly now, so there could be no misunderstanding. The parent authorization, it is linked to Reed Holdings. The name settled into the room like a quiet detonation, not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore. A few people near the back exchanged glances, confusion flickering into recognition for those who understood what that name meant. Ethan did not react immediately. For a fraction of a second, he simply stood there, the connection forming in real time, the pieces aligning in a way that could not be undone. Reed Holdings was not just another company. It was the silent backbone behind multiple ventures, a name that rarely appeared publicly but controlled more than most realized. And now, that name was standing a few feet in front of him, holding a simple toolkit, wearing a badge that no longer seemed accurate. Ethan's throat tightened slightly as he looked at Marcus again, this time seeing past the surface, past the assumptions that had defined the first moments of their interaction. Marcus. Reed, he said slowly, the name no longer casual, now weighted with understanding. Marcus met his gaze, not confirming, not denying, just allowing the truth to exist without needing to announce it. And in that quiet acceptance, the final shift happened, not in words, not in movement, but in perception. The man they had tried to remove from the room had never been out of place. They had simply failed to recognize where he truly stood. Ethan Caldwell did not speak immediately after the name settled into the room, and that silence carried more weight than anything he had said all evening, stretching across the polished marble and crystal light like something that could not be undone once acknowledged. His posture remained upright, but the ease that once defined it was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt deliberate, controlled, as if every movement now required thought instead of instinct. Around him, the room had shifted again, not with noise, not with reaction, but with awareness. The same people who had laughed earlier now stood quieter, their expressions tighter, their attention no longer scattered but focused, as if they were recalculating everything they had just witnessed. Marcus Reed remained where he was, unchanged, his presence no larger, no louder, but undeniably different now that it had been seen for what it truly was. The toolkit still rested in his hand, the badge still clipped to his jacket, but neither defined him anymore. They had become details, not identity. Ethan inhaled slowly, then stepped forward, closing the distance by a few feet, not enough to challenge, just enough to acknowledge. His voice, when it came, was lower, stripped of the sharp edges it carried before. I was not aware, he said. The words were simple, but they did not attempt to excuse anything. They did not deflect. They landed plainly, as if he understood that anything more would only weaken what needed to be said. Marcus did not respond right away. He watched Ethan for a moment, not judging, not measuring, just observing, the same way he had observed everything else from the beginning. The room held its breath again, waiting for something louder, something dramatic, but it did not come. Ethan continued, his tone steady, though quieter now, more grounded in something real. That does not change what happened, he added, glancing briefly around the room. acknowledging the witnesses without addressing them directly. And it does not reflect the standard I claim to lead with. A subtle shift moved through the crowd, not relief, not yet, but recognition that something honest had entered the space. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm, unchanged, carrying the same quiet certainty it always had. Respect is not something you claim, he said. It is something people feel before you say a word. The statement was not harsh. It did not accuse. It simply existed, clear and direct, leaving no space to hide behind titles or roles. Ethan absorbed it without interruption, his gaze steady, his expression no longer guarded, but open in a way that had not been present before. He nodded once, a small movement, but intentional. You are right, he said. No hesitation. No defense. Just acknowledgement. The simplicity of it carried more impact than any explanation could have. Daniel lowered his tablet fully now, no longer needing to reference it, the truth already established. Around them, a few guests shifted slightly, their posture softening, though no one spoke. The room did not rush to fill the silence. It held it, allowed it to settle. Ethan glanced once more at the contract, then reached out and closed the folder gently, not with frustration, not with force, but with decision. The sound of the cover meeting the glass surface was soft, final. He turned back to Marcus. I would like you to stay, he said, not as an order, not as a command, but as a request. Not because of what you represent, but because of what you saw. Marcus considered the words for a moment, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable but not distant. Then he gave a slight nod, not in agreement to authority, but in acceptance of purpose. And in that quiet exchange, the balance of the room settled into something new, no longer defined by status or assumption, but by something far less visible and far more real. The moment did not end with applause or conversation, and that absence felt intentional, as if the room understood that anything louder would diminish what had just settled into place. The chandelier light remained steady above them, casting soft reflections across the marble floor, where Marcus Reed's silhouette stretched long and quiet beside Ethan Caldwell's, no longer separated by invisible lines, but no longer needing to be compared either. The music continued somewhere in the background, a gentle piano melody that had returned to its original rhythm, but now it felt different, less like decoration and more like something distant, almost irrelevant to the gravity that still lingered in the air. Marcus shifted his grip on the toolkit slightly, the metal edges cool against his palm, grounding, familiar, unchanged despite everything that had unfolded around him. He did not look at the crowd. He did not seek acknowledgement. His gaze moved once, briefly, across the room, not to measure reaction, but to understand the space he was leaving behind. Faces that had once carried quiet amusement now held something else, something more restrained, more aware. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. The silence remained intact, not forced, not uncomfortable, but earned. Ethan stood where he was, watching Marcus, not with authority, not with expectation, but with a kind of recognition that did not require words. He did not attempt to extend the moment. He did not call out or interrupt. For the first time that evening, he allowed something to end without controlling how it ended. Marcus turned toward the exit, his steps unhurried, measured, each one soft against the polished floor, barely making a sound. The distance between him and the door was not far, but it felt longer now, stretched by everything that had changed in the space behind him. As he passed the edge of the velvet rope, no one moved to stop him. No one questioned his place. The boundary that had once defined him no longer held meaning. It simply existed, empty of its earlier purpose. The glass doors ahead reflected his figure as he approached, doubling him again. But this time the reflection did not feel separate. It felt aligned, complete, as if the man in the room and the man in the reflection had finally been seen as the same person. He reached the door and paused for just a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but awareness, the kind that marks the end of something without needing to name it. Behind him, the room remained still, the weight of the moment settling into memory, into understanding, into something that would not be spoken about the same way it had been experienced. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly to the closed contract on the table, then lifted it again, not to reclaim control, but to carry forward what had been revealed. The silence between them, though separated by distance now, remained intact, not empty, but full of something quieter than power, something steadier than authority. Marcus stepped through the doors and into the night air, where the city moved as it always did, lights stretching across the streets, distant traffic humming in a steady rhythm that did not pause for moments like this. He inhaled once, slow and even, the cool air settling into his chest, and continued forward without looking back. Inside, the room remained, but it was no longer the same room it had been before he spoke. And in that quiet shift, something had changed, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently, carried not in words, but in the silence that followed.